screen? All right. Well, I assume everybody can hear me. I want to thank everybody for inviting me to do this presentation. I've done it a number of times for different organizations, and it's always fun to do and find other people finally getting a more of an interest in what is a lichen first, and then secondly, actually being more inquisitive as to what they have in their backyard or out in the field when they walk around, besides the flowering plants that you folks are interested in. So anyway, we're going to get right started. Once I know what I'm doing, let's see here. Okay, how do I go to the next page? Let's see. Oh, down here, I think. Yeah. All right. So here's a twig from, not a twig, excuse me. This is a piece of wood from a juniper. And you can see these little red stain growths on the side of this particular twig. And if you take a closer look at it, you see something like this. What you have here is a particular lichen. It's the genus is actually called Caloplaca. And you see these dark red circles, and then you see these light orange colored structures. This is one lichen. The dark red structure you see is actually the reproductive structure for the fungus of the lichen. And the lighter color is the body of the lichen, and that particular part has no sexual structures. It may have some asexual structures, but in this particular species, all you see really is the body of the lichen, and then along with it, these little round circles, which is the reproductive structure, which we'll get into more detail. Anyway, moving on. There was a sign that was at Joshua Tree National Park, and I show this only because it's kind of interesting. Some of it is in the sense that it's the Forest Service trying to show, or the National Park Service trying to show with some explanation about lichens. First of all, they call it a dry land plant, and in many cases, it's not a dry land plant. It says lichens have a short growth periods. That's true, but mainly because they get dried out, and they go into like a suspended animation until such time they get moist again, so they can actually metabolize. They do live in all types of environments. They can live in very extreme conditions, very cold, and also very hot conditions. And actually, you can find some lichens near the vents, not near the vents, but near volcanic areas and stuff where the surface is not really comfortable for anything else. They said in the comment, it says a rock with their home where they may live 1,000 years. And we're not sure if they really live that long, but they do certainly live a long, long time. Anyway, what can they grow on? Well, actually, they can almost grow on anything. Mostly, they can grow on rock, soil, special type of rock called limestone. Can grow on bark. It can grow on just the surface below the bark, which is the actual wood of a woody plant. It has actually been seen growing on glass. It's been seen growing on leaves. And in fact, a colleague of mine, Frank Bunsgaard, who is the lichenologist at ASU, who worked at the Galapagos Islands, has photographs of the Galapagos turtles, those big tortoises, in which lichens are actually growing on their carapace, or the shell of the tortoise. And so you can find it almost in anything, depending on the environment, et cetera. So they have a variety of places where they can land. Of course, some are very specific and only grow on one type of substrate. Others can be more ubiquitous. But anyway, that's where they reside. They can almost be on anything. So what aren't lichens? Well, first of all, they're not flowers. They're not angiosperms, okay? They're not equisetum. They're not a gymnosperm. They're not ferns. They have no vascular tissue whatsoever. Also, they're not moss. And a lot of people confuse lichens for moss, but moss reproduces totally differently. It has two separate life cycles in its life. And the structure, of course, itself is nowhere near what a lichen is. It also is not a liverwort, which are common mainly in riparian areas. So lichens are definitely not any of the things we've just seen. What a lichen is, also we can say that a lichen by itself is not a fungus. It's not a mushroom. By a cup fungus, I mean there's a group of fungi called Ascomycetes. These are the cup fungi. They look pretty much like you see here. The mushrooms, of course, are the Basidiomycetes. Then along with that, what is a lichen by itself? It's not an algae by itself, even though the lichens may be green. And they're not either a cyanobacteria by itself. And those particular lichens that do have cyanobacteria are usually black. The difference between green algae, by the way, and cyanobacteria is that green algae have a nucleus, whereas cyanobacteria don't. And because of that, they were ruled at one time to being blue-green algae, but now they have been split out to be labeled under cyanobacterium. So what is a lichen? It's one of these two fungi, which is going to be mainly Ascomycetes. About 98% of all lichens will have this type of fungal structure, or this type of fungus, which belongs to the group Ascomycetes. There's only a very small percentage that have a Basidiomycete type fruiting body, very rare. The other thing that a lichen has, besides the fungus, is also they have either an algae, a cyanobacterium, or in some cases, they could have both. And we'll explain more about how that can happen as we go along. But again, therefore, a lichen is a fungus and an algae or cyanobacterium. Linnaeus was the first one really to try to describe what is a lichen. And he came up with a Latin term, rustica pauperimi, which meant poor peasants among the plants. So he thought they were plants to begin with, but he thought that they were very primitive type structures, not really more of an interest than the flowering plants, et cetera, that he also studied. So what exactly is a lichen? First of all, it's a symbiotic relationship where each of the groups that compose the lichen are helping each other. Okay, the majority, it's a mutual relationship between one fungus and usually only one of the two algal forms, the green algae or the cyanobacterium. But in some cases, again, it can be both. Again, the ones with cyanobacterium are very, very small number in comparison with those with green algae. The mycobiont, by the way, is the term for the fungus. The algae or cyanobacterium are put into a group called photobionts. And the photobiont, what is the function of the photobiont? It contributes carbohydrates through photosynthesis to the mycobiont. So it's providing carbohydrates for the fungus so it can survive. What does the mycobiont do for the algae that's growing with it? It captures mineral elements because it's the fungus that really attaches itself to the substrate. It protects the algae from excess light and also protects the photobiont from being totally desiccated. In other words, being totally dried out and dying. So there is a lot of different purposes for both groups to be living together. So anyway, moving on. Lichens are comprised basically of two and sometimes three biological kingdoms. First, it's always a fungus, and it's either then a green alga, which belongs to the group Planta, or it's a cyanobacterium, which belongs to the kingdom Monera. which is the blue-green algae. Again, all the organisms that are in this particular kingdom have no nuclei in their cells. They have DNA, of course, but the DNA is just kind of in the cell itself, but never housed in a nuclear wall. Called it, that would be the nucleus. So again, a lichen is a fungus and also either a green algae, cyanobacteria, and in some cases both. Okay, lichens, when you name them, have been named after their fungal component. The algae that you find in lichens, there's not that many different genera that are found in lichens. There are a few, but not as many as the variety of fungi that do associate themselves with either the algae or with the blue-green algae. Okay, lichens themselves, they're placed in the kingdom fungi. So again, they're emphasizing the importance of the fungus in housing either the green alga or the blue-green alga or cyanobacterium, or in some cases both. Okay, the oldest fossil that we now recognize as being a lichen is about 400 million years, 4 million years ago. In that point, they're one of the few first living organisms on land. Okay, and as of the 2016, there were 5,004 total species found in North America and north of Mexico, United States, and Canada. That has almost doubled since that time. And then in Arizona itself, overall for the entire coordinates of the Arizona state, so far in 2010 anyway, 969 species of lichenized fungi have been represented. And then the interesting thing is that number has exploded since that time. It's way over 1,000, and more species are being found. In fact, we found one new species a number of months ago, and we still are being and identifying it more before we write a paper on it to present it. Okay, so the largest number of lichenized fungi are the Ascomycetes, about 98%. And the fungi of Ascomycetes, overall, Ascomycetes themselves, the fungi can live on their own, certain number of genera, et cetera. But of all the Ascomycetes that we know of, 42% are all known to be Ascomycetes. So it's interesting as to how much of this particular group of fungi are actually in relationship to the algae. Again, the lowest number of lichenized fungi are in the Basidiomycetes, again, which is a very small number, only about 2%. And that's worldwide, by the way. Okay, so I mentioned about green algae and cyanobacterium could be on one lichen, in other words, both. In this case, there is a lichen that grows in our area. It's called Peltigera apithosa. It's called the freckled pelt lichen. And you see this green here. This is the algae showing through the upper cortex of the fungus. The little white portion you see here is the undersurface or the lower cortex of the lichen. But on top, you see these little black structures. These little black structures they have a special name called cephalodia. And in those black structures, which is shown here in cross-section, that is where you will find the cyanobacteria. It's not that common, but it's a good example of a symbiotic relationship that is more encompassing than just a fungus and a green alga or a fungus and a cyanobacterium. In this case, it has actually two different photobionts that are involved with the particular species. By the way, blue-green or algae or cyanobacterium are really important in fixing nitrogen. So they also enrich soils, et cetera, which we'll talk about in a little while as to one of their major benefits to the ecosystem. Okay, so again, basic facts, it's a symbiotic relationship. 10% of the lichen species fix nitrogen so that plants can utilize the nitrogen. They produce, again, they photosynthesize. A lot of people think that if you see lichens growing on their trees, that their tree's going to die. They think that the lichen is a parasite. That is not true. Lichens are not parasitic on woody plants or even on plants that may be, lichens that may be growing on leaves, etc. That's not very common, by the way, but in fact, I haven't found anything. I don't think anybody has reported any lichen that grows on leaves recorded in Arizona. Okay, anyway, some of the minerals that are in bark or rock or soil or whatever can be extracted to the lichen and be utilized. But again, there's no harm to the organism where other species of plants would be living. Okay. The other interesting thing is that lichens could grow in habitats where by themselves they couldn't survive on their own. Green algae lichens, for example, can survive by just uptaking water vapor. They don't need to be totally wet in order to keep metabolizing in many instances, as long as there's some humidity. Whereas cyanobacteria do require liquid water. And so you will find cyanobacteria type lichens mainly growing only in moist areas, riparian areas, and also in soils whereby the soils get wet during a rainstorm or whatever, and then the lichens can revive and prosper and photosynthesize, etc. So the other thing I should point out, well, I think we will be bringing that, so I think I'll hold off on the next comment. Anyway, so how can you tell a cyanobacteria lichen from a green alga lichen? Very simply, cyanobacteria lichen, in other words, instead of the ones that have little cephaloid or little dots, that's one thing. But a true lichen that only has cyanobacteria are going to be black or brown in color. The other thing about them is that when you wet them, they become very gelatinous. They're almost like jello. So those particular lichens are very characteristic of being, number one, black, and also having, once they're wet, they're becoming very, very soft and becoming almost like I said, jello or something of that type. Whereas those that have green algae don't have this kind of characteristic. They in fact can live just on humidity alone, and they can go through very long dormant periods, especially here in Arizona, where we have dry summer climates, etc. A lot of lichens are just in a dormant state. They're alive, but they're not metabolizing, or they're metabolizing very low in very low quantity as to when they normally are totally wet. Okay, so how do you can tell cyanobacteria in cross-section? If you take a cross-section of a body of a lichen, and it's a cyanobacteria lichen, you will have an upper cortex, and then growing below, you'll see this kind of brownish, greenish color cells, and that's the cyanobacterium. They're usually single cell. In fact, almost all of them are single cell. Nostoc is one of the cyanobacteria. They're the only ones that are found in chains, where one cell is connected to another cell like a string of beads, but they can live independently. And then on the bottom, usually of a cyanobacterium lichen, there's usually some kind of powdery type or light hair-like coating on the bottom layer, and that's called the tomentum. Now, in green algae, the green alga, the lichen itself, if you do a cross section, has a cortex. Then it has the algal layer. Then it has a middle tissue, which is usually a storage area for carbohydrates. And then it has usually a lower cortex. Not all, but the majority do have a lower cortex. So like under, they have a top skin and a bottom skin, basically what we're saying here. Okay, now again, this is interesting. This Peltigera, which is commonly found here, if you go on Long Canyon Trail, for example, and you look at the bank of the trails, sometimes you'll find these this particular genus. Peltigera is one of the few lichen genera that has cyanobacteria members and green alga members. They belong to the same genus, but again, they're going to be different species. It's unusual, but Peltigera is one of the few genera that has both types of photobionts in one species or another. So again, let's go back to the section through a green alga, the green alga lichen. This is like a cross section of the body of the lichen. And you'll see again, here's the upper cortex. Then there's an algal zone. And here's the medulla or the storage tissue. And then there is a lower cortex. And in some cases, some lichens have little kind of fungal root structures, and they are called rhizines. And that's on the other underside. So if you pull up a lichen and look underneath on the bottom layer, you'll sometimes see like miniature looking roots on the bottom, which is an important characteristic in identifying lichens. So the body of the lichen is called the thallus. And lichens are grouped by their growth forms. So first of all, you have those that you've probably seen on rock, and they look like just round circles on the rock in many cases. And if you try to lift them up, they break apart because they're crusty, etc. And those are called crustose lichens. They belong to that particular category. Secondly, there are some that look like small scales, and they're called squamulous lichens. They're like little tiny pads, and they can be 1 or 2 millimeters in diameter, or 3 or 4, maybe a little bit larger, but they're usually kind of rounded. Not totally, they're going to be a little bit rounded. In some cases, they'll be oblong or whatever. And the other interesting thing is that their margins usually are uplifted off of the substrate. So they kind of turn upwards in many cases. So that's squamulous. And we'll be showing examples of all of these. Next are the sterile crustose. Now, this is going to get a little technical here, but crustose lichens, some have fruiting bodies, which we'll be getting into, and others do not. And so the crustose have been split out even more in regards to whether or not they have a fungal reproductive structure or don't have a fungal reproductive structure. And so crustose come in a couple of categories. The other one we call shrubby, and it looks like a shrub, and they're called fruticose lichens. And again, we'll show examples so you know what I mean. But again, if they look like little miniature bushes, they could be little tufts of fibers, etc., on a tree, or they could be hanging. Like if you take a look at Spanish moss, which is not really a Spanish moss. In many cases, it's named that way, but it's just hanging down. It can grow 5-6 feet long. They would be in the fruticose group. The foliose group is like the one you saw with the Peltigera. It's very leafy in a way. It has broadness to it. In some cases, though, the leaf may only be a centimeter wide or whatever, and they form these lobes, etc. But that particular lichen group, are the leafy group or the foliose lichens. And then there are what we call the umbilicate lichens. And umbilicate lichens almost look like a mushroom. They have a little structure called an umbo, which is like a tiny little stalk that's usually attached to rock. And then growing out of the top of that little stalk, they form these large foliose-like structures. And so they're called umbilicate. And the only reason why they're called that is because they are only attached at one specific point in their structure. Then finally, with the ones we talked about already, the ones that have cyanobacteria in it, the jelly lichens, when wet, they're very jelly-like in texture. Okay. Okay. Now, usually the entire crustose lichens, usually the entire thallus, the body of the lichen is attached to the substrate, rock, bark, cement, etc. And some of these species do have some free parts maybe lifting up, but it's not consistent. And so you have to be careful that when people do taxonomy, that is it squamulous or is it an actual crustose and not a squamulous lichen? And normally what you do, you look at the edges. Some of the species have a thallus that is not visible even, and that it's actually below the rock surface. And then only thing that's showing is the fruiting body. These are called endolithic lichens. Endolithic means within the substrate, not visible on the surface. And we'll be showing a couple examples of that. The crustose lichens do have an upper cortex. They do have an algal layer. They do have a medulla, but they don't have a lower cortex. In other words, there's no lower skin because the lichen is firmly attached to the substrate itself. Okay. Now, squamulose again, those are the ones, here's a this is Sora. This particular one has the margin and the margin is uplifted. It looks like a crustose, but again, it's not totally adhering to the substrate. So it's between the foliose and the crustose type. They're composed of a number of scales, 1 to 15 millimeters in diameter. The 15 millimeter diameter ones are usually not as common as the smaller ones in the state of Arizona. They attach to the substrate, and they have the same structure as a foliose. In other words, they have a lower cortex. But because of their size, etc., they're grouped with the crustose lichens. But even though they are grouped with that, they are still separated out as being squamulose. I know that it may sound confusing, but that's how the keys work when you try to identify them. All right, now some lichens that are sterile have no fruiting bodies present at all. And instead, how do they reproduce? They reproduce by what's called propagules. And what the propagules have are little pieces of a lichen that has both the fungus and the algae attached to it. In this particular case, we have this rock here, and you see this white powdery stuff. And this white powdery stuff is nothing but balls of photobiont being wrapped around by the fungus. And if you rub your finger across that surface, you will get a white powdery substance on your fingers. And those if they land somewhere where they can when they can grow, they will form another lichen just like this. All right, now let's go to the fruticose lichens. Again, they are shrubby. So here we have a species called Usnea. Now I'm going to tell you a little secret about Usnea. When you see a plant like this, what I'd like you to do is pull off one of the strands. And if you pull off one of the strands, you can then wet it. You can wet it with your saliva or water from your water bottle, whatever. And once you get it totally sopping wet, you can grab each end of the piece you pulled off and pull it apart. And when you pull it apart, it'll be elastic. And inside, there'll be a hollow tubing-like structure. And you'll see it here in that second photo. And again, this little tube is the medulla, and it's a cord. And so it's the only only genus that has this characteristic. There's no other lichen genus with this particular characteristic. And so this white tissue here is the medulla. And so if you ever see a shrubby one like this, what you can do is take a test by pulling it apart, make sure it's wet because it's easier, and you'll see this white core in the middle. So anyway, getting back to shrubby, usually they're attached to a bark or whatever by a single point. In other words, when you see this particular Usnea, if you follow it all the way back to its base, it's only attached at one particular point. This whole thing is not attached all over the place. Okay, it's enclosed by an outside covering, the cortex. By being radially symmetric means that you can cut it in any direction you want, and you'll still get the same half. Okay. The exception with shrubby are the genus Cladonia, where the thallus is dimorphic. In other words, there's two parts to it. It has a base, kind of a leaf-like structure, a squamule, and then growing out of it, there'll be a fruiting stalk. And the fruiting stalk is called a podicia. And this particular genus is considered a fruticose. And I'm going to show you now examples of that. And 10 to 1, all of you hopefully may have seen this in the field. These are various types that are grown here in Arizona. They could be growing on rotting logs. They could be growing on soil. They could be growing on the base of trees. They could be growing very close to riparian areas. And there's a ton of different Cladonia species. The little red stuff you may see on Cladonia is their fungal reproductive structures. And in this case, you see them on the top of this particular stalk, the stalk being the podicia. Same here. These are called podicia. Here, and this has cups at the end, and there's some that don't have cups. And then you have these stalks that go down, and they're growing out of a little squamulose. And that's where we get to it being a fruticose type lichen, because it does have a base, but then you have these clusters growing out of the base or the squamule and forming this stalk. And at the end of the stalk, in many cases, you will see fruiting bodies. Okay, then finally folios. Folios are the largest of lichens. They're leaf-like. This particular one here is called Loberia pulmonaria. In medieval times, a lot of people were fed this by the quote-unquote doctors of the time, thinking that it would cure a lung disease because the thallus itself looks like lung tissue, which of course, I don't know if it did anything, but it's bitter as heck. So I wouldn't chew it, I'll tell you that much. Anyway, in this case, you see these projections coming out. These are called lobes. And usually on the bottom of the lobes, you'll see these little root-like structures that I mentioned earlier. And these are called, again, rhizines. The foliose lichens have an upper cortex and a lower cortex, has an algal layer, has a medulla, it has all of the pieces that I've mentioned before. They're the largest of the lichens, and they're less prevalent here in Arizona than in other areas, only because of the dryness in the habitat, et cetera. As you get into higher elevations near Flagstaff, et cetera, you may find more foliose lichens. A lot of the foliose lichens also will be growing on soil, like the two peltigeras I showed you earlier. Those are also foliose lichens. Okay, then we have the umbilicate, the one I told you that is only attached by one point. Here we have the upper surface of this particular lichen, and the lower surface and it is attached usually to rock only by this one projection. And this particular structure is called the umbo. So again, it's almost like a mushroom, but it's not, of course, because there's no gills or anything else underneath. But instead, you have these lobes that will be projected out from this point as they grow. You'll find these mainly on rock, mainly in shaded areas or on underneath overhangs of rock. All right, then the gelatinous ones. This one is called colema. It's found on soil. It's also found on bark, and it's also found on rock, but mainly on soil. And again, there are two genera. There is the colema, and then there's another group called Leptogium, and they're quite common. They're very difficult to identify because they're small, number one. Number two, their reproductive structures are very difficult to locate in some cases, which normally is what you need to help identify them. But again, this is a dried structure. As you can see, it's desiccated. But again, if we wet it, it'll just become slimy and jelly-like. All right, now the colors of lichens. Y'all have seen different colors of lichens. And the lichens are caused by pigments that are found in the cortex of the lichens. Okay, it's like melanin is one. There's others that's anthraquinones, or all these different acids that lichens can produce that other plants or fungi cannot, and it's because of the algae and the fungus in its reactions to producing these different chemicals. And so the yellows, the xanthons, the bright yellows, the anthraquinones, yellow, red, orange. I know this is more than you need to know, but the point is that the coloring of lichens is caused by the various chemicals that are produced in the thallus. And it's a very important characteristic when you try to identify lichens. So anyway. All right, so how do lichens reproduce? First of all, they can reproduce asexually. And they do that, number one, by either fragmentation or they produce actual propagules. By fragmentation, it means they break, they fall somewhere else, or the wind blows it away, they land somewhere, and they actually start growing. Propagules means that sometimes on the lobes of lichens, you'll see little kind of projections coming out like mini lobes. And they, if you touch them, they easily break off. And those are kinds of fragmentations, or propagules that break off that can actually cause the spread of a specific lichen. Now, there's two other structures that may be found or not found on lichens that are also asexual. One is called ascidia, and ascidia, as you see in the diagram, are actually like a little sac, and it's sticking up above the surface of the lichen usually, and inside of it, they have spores. These spores are very special spores because the round structure of the spore is going to be the algae or the cyanobacterium, and wrapped around it is going to be the fungus of the lichen. So it has both already there. It doesn't have to find an algal partner or a fungal partner to survive. It can fly away, land somewhere, and if the environment's right, it'll start to grow. The other structure is called a ceridia. A ceridia, when you look at it under a scope of the body of a lichen, they look like little tiny pustules. And in the pustules, you'll see all these little grains, or granule. It's called granular, but you'll see all these different grains, and the grains are just like the ascidiospores. The ceridiospores are the same type of structures, but in this case, they're produced in two different ways, either by having a sac or having a pustule on the surface of the lichen and forming a ceridium. These are very important items to identify as a species of lichens. You have to use the dissecting scope in many cases to do this and get up to about at least 20 or 40 times normal vision in order to actually see these structures. All right, so this is what like Ceridia looks like. You see this particular lichen. Here's the thallus, the gray structure, but on its edges, you see this little white eruption type structure, and that's Ceridia. And the Ceridia right now in this, are in a what's called a cerealia, and the cerealia in this particular species is crescent shape. And so you see all these Ceridia spores on top. And again, it's both the fungus and the algae. Then you have the Isidia. And the Isidia, you can see here, they just like little mini fingers sticking up. And inside the Isidia is going to be the spores, the acidiospores, which are similar to the Ceridospores because they have the fungus and the algae. And so in that case, then you have this particular species with the Isidia, this one with the Ceridia. And then finally, propagals, you can see this particular foliose lichen, and on the ends, there's these little tiny lobes, and these little lobes break off. And so that's another way they can asexually reproduce. All right, so if we do a diagram of it, what does it look like? Here's the fungal tissue. Here's the algae underneath the algal layer. And here's a little pustule area that broke open. And these algae are come to the surface. And as they come to the surface, they get wrapped up with the fungal hyphae. And then they're dispersed. This is an actual electron micrograph of a Ceridiospore, the alga cell, and then here are the fungal hyphae that are wrapped around it. All right, then here's another example of Isidia. These are very dramatic on this particular. Platyspacia is not found in our area. It's found in mainly in more moist areas, riparian areas, more in the deep forested areas of the Northwest. And here you see all these little finger projections. Again, inside of them are the acidiospores, which again is going to be the algae and the fungus. And if they're released, they have the possibility of actually forming a new lichen asexually. All right, so how do lichens reproduce sexually? All right, this is kind of a real strange situation. The mycobiome or the fungus can sexually produce spores, but the photobiont doesn't. The sexual structures of the fungus is either called an apothecia or perithecia. But what happens here is that the spores that are produced, which are fungal spores, they're released. And the only way they're going to form a new lichen is if they come in contact with an algae that they are compatible with. And if they're not going to grow anything. So it's a strange situation, but these spores that are produced by the fungus, the reason why they're called sexual is because that's how they are formed. They are formed by hyphae actually coming in contact with another hyphae filament, and from that there's an exchange of DNA, et cetera, and then forming through meiosis, et cetera, and forming these spores. And again, it's either going to be a cup-like structure, because the majority of lichens, again, are ascomycetes, which are cup fungi, or they form what's called a parathecium, which is also part of ascomycetes. It's in smaller numbers. In this case, it has a little hole at the top surface of the thallus, and it forms a bowl underneath. And in that bowl, it forms the ascospores, and then they are released out through that hole. And we're going to show examples of what that really looks like in some photomicrographs. So going to the cup structure first, the one that you saw in the previous slide, this is kind of the structure of the sexual formation of the cup fungi. You have the cup, and right underneath this layer, which is usually colored, it could be black, brown, it could be red, it could be yellow, whatever, you'll find these little sacs. And in these sacs will be spores. And these spores, when they are mature, will break out of these sacs and go somewhere and hopefully find an algae. By the margin, you don't have to worry about this much, but when you take a look at it like a disc, sometimes they have a ring around the outer edge. If they have a ring around the outer edge, the ring will either have algae in it or no algae in it. And other than that, you don't have to worry about the terminology. But again, there's some characteristics there. All right, so here's some disc lichens. Here we have Sora. Sora has a round type epithecia or fungal reproductive structure. Here is a Caloplaca that has disc-like structures. That you can see this is a millimeter ruler. So these particular apothecia are only about 1 millimeter in diameter. This is going to be the upper surface of the disc. But as soon as you cut into it, as you see here in the lower photograph, the purple area you see on top is the stained area of where the asci are at that carry the ascospores. Here's that margin I mentioned on the outside of the deal. Now on this particular lichen, you can see a little white ring around each disc. And so that means this particular lichen has a margin. A lot of lichens do not on their disc. If you finally get a cross section of a asci, in other words, the little sac inside of the disc, and if you blow it up, this is done at 1,000 times magnification, you will actually can see the spores inside the sac. This particular measurement, the distance between each one of these small lines, by the way, is 1/1000th of a millimeter. It's a micron. So you can see that these spores are extremely small. And in fact, the photograph is taken under 1,000 times magnification. It's a special type of lens called an oil immersion lens that allows you to do this. And again, you see these spores being developed, which later on will be released. There's other types of fruity bodies. There are some lichens that form these little script-like structures, little lines, and the apothecia and the asci, et cetera, all are in between these two black lines. So in the middle, this would be the disc if it was a disc lichen in the center. The outside is just the margin of the reproductive structure. Then there's another type that's called pincushion lichens. They are extremely small, maybe about 1 millimeter or maybe more, maybe 2 millimeters at the most. And they're usually endolithic, or in other words, the thallus is in the bark or the rock or whatever. And all you see is a stalk. And on top of the stalk is nothing but a load of ascospores. In other words, like a big powder puff of spores. And it's very difficult to see, but if you go and look on dead wood with a hand lens, sometimes you will find these particular type of lichens. So these are two other types. There's other things besides these types, but those are the most common in our area. Okay, let's go back to the parathecium again. So the parathecium, again, is sunken into the thallus. It has it has a wall around it, forms a wall. The opening is called an ostiole. And again, the asci are inside, containing the ascospores. And when the asci break open, they usually shoot out of here. And again, after that, they're on their own to try to find a mate. In other words, an algae. Here's another umbilicate lichen that we talked about before. And there is hundreds of little tiny dots on the upper surface that you can just barely see. If you take a section of this tiny dot, this is what you'll get. This is a cross section of the parathecium that's embedded inside the tissue of this umbilical type lichen. So in this case, here we have the spores of this particular species enclosed in this parathecium. And again, the ostiole will open up, and these will be released when time comes, and that's what will occur. Spores themselves come in a variety of places, of sizes and shapes. Some are only one cell. Some are two-celled. These are called septa, but anyway, they have a little cross wall. Some have more cross walls and longitudinal and et cetera. These are called muriform spores, and these spores are usually very large. And here you have another muriform spore. Here's ascus with ascospores. In this case, this is a single spore, and there's no cross wall. In cross walls, you can have some spores with 5 or 6 or 7 cross walls on it, depending on the species and the genus. Septate means, by the way, a cross wall. So when you see one septate, that means it has 2 cells really, and it's divided by a cross wall or a septate. So it's a one septate spore. Here's another close-up of a Buellia that grows right here in our area. In fact, this is one I collected and in cross-sectioning of the apothecia, which is right here and here and here and here, these little black ball-like structures. You get to the spores. The spores in Buellia, the genus Buellia, are brown, and Venusta is the only one that has 3 cross walls, 3 septa. So it's 3 septate, in other words, 4 chambers, and it's the only species of Buellia that has that many cross walls. Other Buellias only have 1 septate. There are some Buellia that are muriform, but again, this is just an example of this particular group of lichens. Okay, now lichens also have some beneficial uses. They're colors and dyes. The Native Americans used them to make their dyes for their rugs and yarn and stuff. They are used in perfumes, mainly in Europe, and there are some pharmaceuticals that are made mainly from Europe. Usnea, the one we saw where you can pull the cord apart and you get a center cord, that particular organism produces usnic acid, and usnic acid has been found to be beneficial in some pharmaceutical areas that I'm not really know very much about, but anyway. Okay, so let's go to actually looking at some lichens themselves in more larger photographs. Here we have it's the same rock. One's taken on one side of the rock and one's taken on the other side of the same rock. You'll notice there's a prolific amount of growth of lichens on this side, hardly any on this side. Does anybody have an answer? I know you're not speaking in the group, but I'll let you think about it a little bit. The answer is, this is the north side of the rock. This is the south side of the rock. South side of the rock gets a lot more heat exposure. North side doesn't. And so in this case, the lichens here are more compatible on the north side than on the south side. All right, the next thing I do want to speak about is why you see these signs all over the place. Biological soil crust. Biological soil crust is composed of lichens, algae, liverworts, bacteria, free fungi. This particular crust grows here in the Sedona area, and if you step on it, it'll take 100 years for it to reproduce and to form another soil crust. Why is that important? Because the soil crust enriches the soil for higher plants to grow. It's an ecological step in regards to the growth of higher plants. And it has to be protected. And right now it's being destroyed very easily in our area because of bicyclists and because of hikers that go off trails and bicyclists that go off trails. And it's really becoming really a sad affair here in this area. This is what you'll normally see in Sedona area. It's an unusual type of soil structure. It's called pinnacle soil. What happens is that because of the freezing and thawing of the soil when it's wet, etc., it starts to rise and it forms these columns. And for some reason, the lichens and bacteria and everything else that is found in the soil loves this type of surface. And so it's, again, all this material, it's like it shows here, the cyanobacteria, algae, microfungi, lichens, mosses, liverworts, they live on top of this stuff. And one of the main reasons, of course, is light, but it's found mainly on pinnacle soil. Regular soft crushed soil, you won't find this at all. It's only found in this type of soil crust. And again, it's very common in our area, but it's being destroyed. It also helps in soil stability, has other features besides it, and nutrients for the soil. And anyway, but again, it's really important that we try to protect this soil crust that we have here. Here are some of the lichens that are found on soil crust. You have this white lichen here, Acrospora nutrilosa. What's interesting about Acrospora is that the asci, the sacs that hold the spores, they hold over 100 spores per asci. Then you have Placidium, which is a cyanobacterium algae. Here's a Cladonia. Here's the cup right here, and it's growing out of a squamule. Here's another Cladonia, again, growing out of a squamule, a third one. And then we have this little thing here called Diploschissus muscorum. Sometimes it's called cow vomit, but when it's young, it parasitizes Cladonia. In other words, this particular lichen is licolinus. In other words, it'll grow over the Cladonia and feed upon its nutrients when it's young, and then it becomes independent. So when you see this, you'll normally see it in conjunction with Cladonia, unless it's a very, very mature form. But again, that's found on a biological soil crust. Some others, here we have a Peltigera we talked about before. Here's what we call Petula, which is like a big cup-like structure, and it has little reproductive structures on its margin of the cup. Here's a lichen called Fisconia, another Sora with a black little reproductive structures. And here's another Sora with a little black reproductive structure, same genus. And here's another one that is a Sora. Again, and these are squamules. And again, it has little black structures. This one is very pretty. When it rains, it actually just turns the soil green. And you take a hand lens, you take a look at it, it really is a neat organism. Okay, now, Usnea, we're going to go back to our fruticose lichen. This is the one that's found in higher elevations here in Arizona, mainly above about 5,000 feet. In fact, we found one on our field trip this weekend on an old dead branch of a tree. And we had fun pulling it apart and showing the cord, etc. Again, has this cord that's in it. It's a green algae. Has little spiny type branches. It's only attached at one point. In this case, you can see the apothecia. The apothecia, the fruiting bodies, are usually at the end of these different branches. And it's the most common species in the Western United States, mainly, and in fact, here in Arizona as well. Okay, another fruticose lichen is Ramalina. Here's another one you may find walking along West Fork. It grows on a lot of various trees, and you'll see like a little fan-like structure. It's a real pretty little lichen, and it has its reproductive structures at the tip, the apothecia, et cetera. But again, it has usually a flat surface, but then it thins out and becomes these little tiny branches. So this is a fruticose, very common Ramalina. You'll come across it if you walk along West Fork and just look on the bark of the trees, right at eye level. They'll be there, and it's a real neat little organism. Okay, this one you've probably seen all over the place. If you see mesquite or anything else, you'll see the bark of these shrubs with this golden color. And this particular lichen is called Xantha Mendoza Thalax. And if you look closely at it, here's the disc. It's an apothecia structure. And if you look even closer at that, this one doesn't show it very well, but it has a crescent moon shape on its margins, and it's loaded with ceridia. And so here we have asexual reproductive structures and a sexual reproduction, and it is very common, and you'll see this almost everywhere. Another lichen that is very common is Flavopunctilia ceridica. This grows mainly on pine, and when you see it, it's just green, and you'll see these little white areas. It doesn't produce fruiting bodies, apothecia. Instead, it produces ceridia in these little margins. And so when you see, you'll see this, here's all the ceridia in these little white areas. And so you have a green thallus, and then all of a sudden you see all these eruptions on the surface. And again, those are the ceridia. And it's a very common lichen. You can walk almost anywhere in the where there is any woods at all that have pine. And it's also found sometimes on juniper, and it's usually right at eye level, so you can see it growing on the side of the tree. Another, again, the Sora. There's a close-ups again. Again, these are soil lichens. Again, the big characteristic is it's squamulous and the little black reproductive structures that are associated with it. These are 4 different species of this particular genus. Okay. Then you probably all seen this lichen. This is, I call it the weed of the area. It's there's a number of species. It's called Xanthoparmelia. It is a foliose lichen. In some cases, very, very tiny, but it forms lobes, and it grows almost on any type of rock. It also can grow on bark, but mainly on rock, and it grows most of it grows on sandstone type rock. In studying Xanthoparmelia, it's a very difficult genus because you have to do extraction of its acids that it produces in order to identify the species. And this is done by what's called thin layer chromatography, where you take a dissolved lichens and you spot it, then you run a chemical up it, and it moves the various substances at different distances so you can identify the chemicals that are in it. Okay, and there's another photograph, in this case done in UV light, the same plate. Moving on. So here's all kinds of Xanthoparmelia. This one is called Mexicana, and the characteristic of this particular Xanthoparmelia is the isidia. It's just loaded with isidia. You don't see fruiting bodies as much as you see isidia growing all over the place on the surface of the lichen. Other common rock shields are, I didn't label these, but again, you'll see various types with lobes. They're all almost the same type of characteristics. Some have very large apothecia that are brown, like here and below. But again, these are all different types of rock shield lichens. There's at least 30 different, about 25 different species that are growing in around this area. It's a very large group. La Praria, this is the dust lichen. Again, this is where you have all the ceridia. If you rub your finger across it, you'll have powder in your fingers, and that's just going to be ceridia. It doesn't really have a true thallus. It just forms this gobs of Ceridia on soil and rock, and sometimes on bark. Then here's one that's where you don't have a thallus. Instead, all you see is these black reproductive structures. This is called sarcodine. If you cut these open, they have they're loaded with spores in the outside. But again, they just look like tiny little dots on the rock. The thallus is in the rock itself. Now, here's an example of a study of this. This is done by the professor down at ASU. He's studying this particular lichen. And what he did, he stained the inside of the rock. He made a cut of the rock, and he stained it with a particular dye that only stains the fungi. And you can see here that on the towards the surface of the rock, it's loaded with fungal material that has embedded itself inside the rock. Again, this is an endolithic lichen, but again, the fungal part of the component is in the rock itself. All right, then Peltigera is another neat lichen you might see on the trail. It's called the dog lichen. Its reproductive structures are on the edge. They look like tiny little saddles, and they're brown. It's a foliose lichen, and it gets fairly large, as you can tell with this centimeter ruler. Okay, here's a jelly lichen. This one's like Legionella nigridia. This one grows very large. It can form. It usually forms on seeps. So when you take a look at a seep, you may find this slimy stuff growing down the side of it, and that's going to be a cyanobacterium lichen. And in this case, this particular lichen belongs to the genus Legionella. All right, then another one you'll find common, usually around moist rock areas, is Phaeophycea. And the only reason I bring this up is because if you take a hand lens, you'll see tiny little whiskers sticking out from the lobes. Those are rhizines, actually, but they stick out. It's very characteristic. They're black and they have white tips. And if you see that, it's going to be the genus Phaeophycea, and it's called a shadow lichen. Okay, when you look at the side of a cliff, you see yellow all over the place, right? That is Acrospora socialis. That is what you're seeing are millions and millions of crustose lichens, all growing adjacent to each other, and they form this huge growth. It almost look like a painting on the rock. So every time you see a face cliff with a yellow wall on it, most probably this is the organism you're seeing. And you see how minute they are. And so how many do you think it really needs in order to see it so visually as we hear around here, as around this area? Another one you might see walking along, usually on sandstone that's on a walkway or on a bedrock, you'll find this particular Acrospora, and this one is strigata. So if you take a hand lens, it looks like just gray something or other on the sandstone, but if you take a close look, you'll see all these little tiny crustose aerial pads, and the black spots are the reproductive structures. Then another one you'll find is Caloplaca. Usually it's orange or red. Sometimes it's gray. And a characteristic of its spore is that here's the spore, but the wall here is not connected. There's a little pore that runs from one side to another. And that's the characteristic of the spores of this particular genus. It's very common, found in rock, found on bark, and it'll be usually orange or reddish in color. It's more difficult to identify when it's gray and black. Again, here's the Diploschissus again. Again, this is the one that's a parasite on Cladonia. And when it's a juvenile, it's parasitic. We mentioned that before. Okay, and there's again, the one that has a parathecia. This is Dermatocarpon americana. This is how you will see it sometimes underneath an overhang. It'll be growing in the shade of an overhang that's kind of moist, and you'll see all these tiny, tiny pads all over the place. And that is going to be an umbilicate type lichen. Then again, here's the ones that are pin cushion lichens. This is what's growing on juniper. You can see how small they really are. Again, the black ball you see is just loaded with spores. And that ends my presentation.
Thank you very much, Gary. That was wonderful. And I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, and then we'll open it up for questions and answers.